Okay, it is 12:01 for me on the East Coast of the United States. We've actually got a panel full of Germans. Well, folks who live in Germany. So you all not on the East Coast, much later for you in your day. Thank you for joining us. We'll give folks some time to filter in, but I'll just start with a little bit of preamble and folks can get caught up as we get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this lead dev panel discussion. We're talking about bridging the gap between requirements and technical details. This is a webinar created in partnership with Vercel. So the webinar will last 45-ish minutes, and it'll be myself moderating the discussion with these panelists. We have some great folks for you today. And you can head over to the lead dev Slack after the panel in the webinar Q&A channel, and we'll be answering questions there, either questions that came in during the webinar via the Zoom Q&A option that didn't get answered, or we can keep the conversation going, or anything else that comes up after we've turned our videos off that you want to talk about. So we'll be hanging out in there for a little bit. Like I mentioned, there's a Zoom Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions as we get going. We'll try to weave in what we can. There's a lot of content that we have prepped for you, but we'll sort of follow the flow and see where those questions take us as they come in as well. Nothing is set in stone. So, okay, with all the preamble, let's get started with some introductions. I'm Maud. I'm a principal software engineer at GitHub. I've had kind of a strange tenure there because, of course, people in their right mind start jobs when they're 7 months pregnant and then go on leave and then come back. That's what I did. Before that, I was at Slack. I've been involved with a number of different lead dev initiatives over the years. I think it's a great organization. I love being part of it. And right now at GitHub, I'm working on Copilot code review. And without further ado, all right, I'm going to start by asking Lais, tell us about you.
Hi everyone. So I'm Lais. I'm based in Berlin. I'm a principal engineer at Nubank. Nubank is a digital bank based in Brazil, but also operates in other countries in Latin America. I'm primarily focused in the last years more like on cloud infrastructure.
Great, thanks. Mariano.
Yeah, well, my name is Mariano. I live in Berlin too. I work at Vercel. I'm a staff product manager here, taking care mostly of everything related to CI/CD and compute. So yeah, anything that is running on Vercel, you can yell at me.
That's great. And finally, we have Anthony.
Hey everybody, I'm Anthony. I'm the VP of Engineering at Charles. We help brands communicate with their customers via WhatsApp, so send out like marketing campaigns, but also interactive like AI agents and different things, so they can stay in touch. Yeah, I've been in the engineering management world for a while now. So before Charles, I was the VP of Engineering at GetSafe, a German insurtech, and was in different management roles before that too. So super excited for the panel today.
Great. And one of the things that I was telling the panelists when we were chatting earlier this week is that I love that we have a different set of roles. And so we have the PM on the requirement side. We have the engineering IC on the requirement side. We have the engineering manager. We just need like a data science person and a designer, I was told, also important, and maybe like a customer success person. And then we'd have all pieces of the picture, but we can focus on these today. So to kick our conversation off today, I wanted to talk about each of you. I wanted a story from each of you about what is the most costly miscommunication mistake you've seen between business and engineering, and what did it teach you about the importance of requirements gathering? And we will kick things off with Lais.
Okay, so yeah, I have a little story to tell. I think one of the most costly examples I've seen was a product launch being delayed by nearly a year. And the root of all that delay was definitely like a miscommunication between business and engineering, specifically around regulatory requirements. Not very fun. So my read on the situation was that business was so focused on the technical execution like getting the infrastructure provisioned, the services up and running, the mobile app functioning. And I think they assumed the hard part of the work was the execution. So the regulatory requirements were never much in focus. And then myself and other engineers also trusted that like business folks had done their part understanding those requirements. And then for a little bit more context, so it was decided that part of the customer acquisition process was going to run as a global service shared across different countries. And then we built that infrastructure as requested for global service. But then only after it was already in place, like a couple months later, we found out that due some regulatory requirement, this service had to run as a like dedicated instance for that specific country. We could have applied for like a special like homologation with the regulator, but the process was very uncertain and would have taken months. So we had to rebuild the whole thing as a country-specific service. And this is just one example. It wasn't a one-off. So it happened in other parts of the system too. And individually, each of these adjustments might seem like minor, but then collectively, they delayed the product launch, yeah, close to a year. I think a big lesson there is like if your product touches anything regulatory, you need those requirements fully clarified upfront. Like the cost of change is just too high once these things are already built. And I know lots of you are probably lucky enough to be working in a highly regulated industry, but I have also seen this happening with most things involving third-party integration. So it's also something to kind of keep an eye on. I felt like we could have anticipated some issues and be more prepared to proactively ask the right questions that could have avoided the miscommunication. And then after that, like we kind of developed this checklist and some guides with things we need to check and ask before building new infrastructure as a kind of our attempt to be more proactive and ask in case requirements aren't handed to us. We established like this baseline containing like some minimal capabilities and made it clear that anything beyond that also had to be explicitly requested. So yeah, just avoid surprises and be proactive and ask.
Yikes. Before we move on, though, that's a doozy. Uh, I'm curious. So you're saying, right, that like probably some of us don't work in like highly regulated fields, which pros and cons, obviously. But given that experience that you had, and given that sometimes there's like the unknown unknowns, right? Of you don't know that there is actually regulation around this thing that you are hoping to put out into the world. What do you see that sort of iteration feedback cycle ideally look like? Do you envision that it's like a business concern or a product concern that like then gets bubbled up to, say, if you have a legal team or something, they should do some due diligence early on, and then you sort of iterate in that way? How can you get like quick feedback on ideas in that space?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of like working on some sort of like playbooks beforehand and having, I think most of those things, especially when we're talking about regulations and also with third-party integrations, I think lots of those things can be anticipated. So kind of trying to build some playbooks and like, okay, what are the things we really need to check here? I think that's this could be very helpful. I think as like to the iteration cycle, yeah, I feel like of course, we don't need every little thing to be known before, but I think some things, yes, for example, might be important, like if you're running in the cloud, what regions you're using, like is it even allowed, like with the data residency requirements and all this type of things. So I think we do need to have some like pre-work uh, done in order to start with some of those things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. especially when you're seeing like sort of the trend in these sorts of regulations like GDPR, et cetera. Like there is a trend, right? And so like there's also a little bit of anticipating of the trend that you can do on your own. All right, over to you, Mariano. Let's hear your horror story.
Yeah, it's not that much of a horror story. I feel like we were able to find something on time. You know, recently at Vercel, we released something called Fluid Compute that is a new execution model. What it does is basically changes the one-to-one usual rule that you have between invocation and instance as is running on cloud to now an instance can handle multiple invocations. That gives you a lot of benefits, a lot of efficiency, because when you have idle time, you can fill that idle time with other invocations, with other requests, and make everything much more cheaper for the customer end of the day. That's how we ended up shipping Active CPU a couple of weeks ago, where now you don't pay CPU when you are not actually using the CPU with a full Node.js environment. And in those kind of projects, I feel like something that you need to be really careful about, and is where communication or miscommunication can delay your project a lot, is on how much is good enough. And what do I mean by this? Sometimes you have certain metrics that ideally you want to make them go to zero, for example. For example, the time that it takes since a request gets into the network until it starts getting processed. The ideal answer would be, hey, from an engineering standpoint, I want to bring it to zero. It should be instant. It should be something you just come and start processing. But sometimes you have to, find out what's the sweet spot between what will take us 1 year and what will take us 1 month and what will take us 1 week, and find how much you want to optimize. Sometimes lacking that kind of optimization, or lacking that kind of definition on how much do you want it to be considered releasable, might make people get into rabbit holes. It gets you out of clarity, it gets you out of context, because you don't know what are you aiming to, what you should be building to. So yeah, I think like that's like the most costly miscommunication that I've seen around. On this case, we were able to catch it and we were able to define it quite early in the process. But looking at it in retrospective, it's like, oh, I'm happy we were able to catch it and we were able to define all of this stuff before it becomes a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's always the worst when you end up in a situation. You're like, wait, you didn't actually care about this thing that I spent 10 hours doing?
Yeah, and it's one of those things, like bringing it down from 1 minute to 100 milliseconds might be like a 2 weeks thing. It's not, but just giving an example on time. But then going from 100 milliseconds to 98 milliseconds is like, oh, that's 3 months extra work. Have you seen the XCCD meme of how do I make something that can recognize any person's face in the world? Oh, that'll be 1 hour. What if I want to also recognize if there is a tree in the picture? Oh, that's going to be 3 years. Well, it's kind of like that.
How do you bring up those conversations in, say, like an initial sort of like planning meeting? Or is that also something that you're hoping to like train the engineers that you work with to like preemptively think about?
Yeah, I think that mostly comes from, I see my function as a context provider for our engineers. Like what I always want to do is enable our engineers to make the decisions by themselves and to understand when is the value being generated and how does that scale. If you have like an imaginary graph of value I'm creating based on how much I'm optimizing something, where is that sweet spot? So it usually is something that we have been like training with the team, working together so many years, and we know where we are approaching. Usually we discuss also all of this stuff before, like we run our PRDs, we run our request for comments documents with all of the technical details and implementation details. And there we align and we find out like, hey, maybe this is more of a nice to have. Hey, this should be actually a must have. And there is where we get together the customer feedback with the engineering and technical side of things, and we end up making what's going to be our release. And also usually the next few releases are also planned in that stage.
Great. Before we move on to Anthony, another question for you, especially around this like requirements gathering step of these PRDs, et cetera. How much feedback is too much feedback?
I think like to me feedback is a gift. I want as much feedback as possible, but I will be conscious on how much get acknowledged, how much get actually added, and how much will be promised for a future version. Like I feel you have to be conscious on how much will something affect your time to market, how much will something affect, for example, your cost or your pricing, like your whole model that you already have in your company, how much something is also aligned with the values and with the message that you want to give as a company. Each company has its own brand. So sometimes some feedback might be off brand. So I think like it really depends on the type of feedback. I always accept all of the feedback, respond to all of it, but it doesn't mean that all of the feedback will be treated equal.
Right. Fair. Great. Okay, Anthony, your turn.
Yeah, mine's actually a little bit of a combination of the two. So when I was at GetSafe working in insurance, we were building a new car insurance product, which was something we had never done before. And there were lots of insurance experts, lots of engineers, but we were also working with an external company that was kind of a partner and kind of providing the insurance backing. So lots of people with lots of different expectations and lots of opportunity for miscommunication. And what we ended up finding would happen is because engineers were aware that there were lots of regulatory requirements and certain very specific things, they would go to the insurance expert and say, well, how do we want to do this? And the insurance expert would come back and say, well, do it this way. And then we would build it that way. Well, what we then discovered later is, well, that was just one way to do it. It wasn't actually that it absolutely had to be done that way. Certain things actually had to be done that way, but other things where it's like, yeah, hey, this is what the manual process looks like, so we should just do the digital process that way too. And what made this so costly was we actually didn't have any delays because we had a hard deadline. So it ended up meaning that people had to do a lot of kind of late nights and some weekend work to get the product out when it needed to get out. But we also saw a lot of pains late because insurance policy. You have regulatory basically the okay, well that was bad. So we learned our lesson, and how we got better at this was a little bit similar to what Leigh said too, is you basically have very clear like checklists and playbooks kind of thing to say, okay, when we're building a new insurance product, these are the things that absolutely must happen. We need to make sure these things are covered, and we need to have very clear answers to this. And similar to what Mariana was just saying, we have to understand, okay, this is really, really necessary and an absolute regulatory requirement versus this is just a nice to have, or this is one approach for doing it. So doing that really helped us subsequently, but caused a lot of pain over time to have gotten these things wrong at the beginning.
Gosh, it's like what terrible decision is going to be discovered this year?
Kind of, yeah, exactly.
Is this on your bingo card? Oh man, yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure we've all been there in one way, shape, or another. Lace had already mentioned this in her story, and you sort of alluded to it as well. The playbooks, and PRDs were mentioned. Like tools have already been mentioned in this conversation, so I sort of want to take us on a little bit of a path towards tools, templates? What are those types of things that you like could not currently live without in when you are doing this like requirements gathering process and working with other folks to build that out? And I think we'll start with, oh, we had a good discussion about this on Monday in our prep. Mariano, you had a great answer to this.
Yeah, I think like the one I cannot live without is B0 because mostly I use it for prototyping all of the time. It has saved me so much time on iteration, you know. Now, to me, a prototype is part of the things that I need to give as documentation to my engineers, to designers, to whomever. It's something that, for example, as a PM, I would have an idea, I would have like a problem I want to solve. I will go to B0, I will be playing on it, I will be adding stuff into a dashboard. I will be even when it's not something visual, I will be like mocking APIs. I would be like doing all of these imaginary little product in a sandbox. And sometimes I will even bring it to customers and I will play with it with customers live. I would ask them, hey, let's jump on a call. And instead of showing like an static design or just talking, I will be like, okay, and what about if we had this other thing? And we will start iterating on top of the V0 together. Recently, we released rolling releases. That is basically the ability to have canary releases on Vercel. And that was a feature that was born on a V0 prototype that was brought to customers. And we started like talking like, hey, if you were to have a native canary support, how would you envision it to be? At what level do you want it to work? Will it be at deployment level? Will it be at project level? Like how do you see it? I had my own take on it and then start iterating on top of it until I was able to already go to the engineering team with a really clear idea on what we wanted to solve, how we wanted it to look like. And again, it's a prototype, so we don't expect that it ends up being implemented on a one-on-one because obviously there is like a lot of design feedback. There is a lot of actual feasibility after what the PM has drawn on V0. But, you know, to me, it has become part of my life. I try now to avoid PRDs, and I am mostly just giving like problem and a prototype and be like, okay, this is a world where I want to live. I want to be able to click this and this should happen. And there we go. So yeah, it has been great for that.
How do people give comments on that?
Usually I end up like if they're doing like a preview on Vercel,
Yeah.
so then you
Yeah.
can go and just comment in the preview, or I just
Okay.
share the chat in our team. Like I create all of
Okay.
these prototypes on the Vercel enterprise team on B0, and then people can go fork it. And this is something that happens a lot. Is like I do something, then someone else forks it, and it's like, oh, I actually would like to have it more looking like this. And they send you, there is your fork, and then you
Neat.
can also fork that and keep iterating on top. And you end up with a lovely chain of forks until you find out which one do you like and how do you want to, you know, converge. But yeah, the collaboration part there is awesome.
That's really neat. Yeah, because I'm so used to like you go into a doc and you like drop some comments, right? And then they like end up resolved or whatever. Um, but when you have the prototype in front of you, like that is particularly compelling. On the like other side where we're like building docs and maybe using a little bit more of a concrete old school method of requirements gathering. I know Lais, you had some thoughts. Obviously you alluded to playbooks at the start.
Yeah, I think on the a little bit more old school, yeah, I think I really like I think as part of, I'm not sure if that's really a part of requirements gathering, but I feel like it's somehow part of the process, like on the decision making part of this. So I really love to just use decision matrices when we can just compare different things we want to achieve against like different criteria. So I think this is helpful for either kind of validating some hypothesis or even like more on the solution kind of space. So I use this a lot, and I feel like it's just very helpful to communicate and help us make like faster decisions. I think it's a pretty like concise way of like encapsulating decision making as part of understanding what requirements and how to make that progress to kind of more on a solution discussion.
I hope you're enjoying this video, but did you know Lead Dev has a lot more to offer?
When I think about lead dev, I think about bricks and hearts. Bricks are those foundational things that you need to know, and lead dev provides that through webinars, through videos, through cutting edge research. But hearts are the things that you need to glue yourself to the people at work, and lead dev does that through conferences and meetups.
Make sure you check out leaddev.com.
Yeah, and I could see like different stakeholders sort of wanting different sort of artifacts to point to in terms of like, oh yes, these requirements have been gathered, these requirements have been gathered, this is how we're sort of weighing everything together. In your opinion, if we're talking minimum viable documentation to move from like requirement to like, okay, let's go do the thing now, how do you balance that? How do you balance the like thoroughness, maybe not too thorough, with the speed, the agility of like getting things done?
Yeah. So I think if I'm thinking about like a minimum, it's a lot, I think, around on understanding what the problem is actually. So like being clear on the problem statement. I don't care much like of a template as long as like the content is there. So like a clear problem statement, just to get relevant data as evidence for the problem, maybe some diagrams showing like before, after, like what's the world like today. I think it was a little bit of what Mariano was talking about, like, yeah, showing some things like this is the world I want to see. This is how I want things to be like. So how the world is now, how I want things to be after, evaluate like trade-offs and get feedback from relevant stakeholders, because I think everybody has an opinion, but I think we need to really find like what are the key people we want to have feedback from. And I think, I mean, that's the very minimal now. Like some people think about like having documentation as like a bureaucratic thing, or we're just gonna write and then we're gonna spend like this long cycle. I don't think that's necessary. I think the point here would be more like documenting important decisions or important parts of the problem. It doesn't have to be bureaucratic. Enough is enough. And then I think it has to be practical and useful. I think it helps when teams can use those artifacts to get alignment on what needs to be done after. And also for the future, on the times when everybody's like, oh, like a year from now or 2 years from now, we'll be like, why did you even do that? Like, that makes no sense. And then we have this thing that we can come back to, and it's like, oh, this is what we were thinking at that time. This is very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of that really resonates. I know, Anthony, you had thoughts about like the good enough when there's pressure to ship, and how we can like weigh that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think coming back a little bit to the documentation too, right? I think one of the things I really love to see from engineers to kind of finalize that documentation process, making sure the requirements are clear, is that they go in and do technical spikes, right? And not just, hey, I'm going to start prototyping something, and not, hey, here's the one plan, but really understanding what's our option space, right? How do we possibly approach this? And I think that's the artifact that I most love to see before we go after a project. Sometimes I struggle to get engineers to do it because they feel like, oh, I know how I want to build it, just let me go do it. But I think it solves exactly the problem also that Lais was talking about, is that you can go back later and see, wait, why did we decide to go this way? and you can see that decision-making process. And I think also to kind of the good enough requirements, it links very well to that, because again, you can then see those trade-offs, and you're not just saying, oh, here were the requirements, so we build it this way, but you can kind of weigh and say, look, we could build it this way, and that comes with these trade-offs, and it'll take us this long, versus we could build it this other way, and we'll be faster, or we don't know exactly how that part's going to work. But you at least understand before you go into it exactly what those trade-offs look like. And I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, it can also be like so helpful for, I mean, I think even folks who think they're abstract thinkers are not usually necessarily the best abstract thinker. I'm not a good abstract thinker. I need to go actually like hands-on keyboard, poke at some things to really understand the rough edges. So I very much subscribe to that idea, like and subscribe. But I think it also gets us into these like the unknown unknowns territory, right? Of how do you broach that topic? How do you make sure that it's not the like elephant in the room that no one's talking about? I know that that's like hung me up in the past, where I've definitely said like, well, there's like this whole category of unknown unknowns in a planning meeting where we're trying to get this thing out, and freaked everyone out. And said, well, we got to add like 3 more weeks before we ship, because there's this whole pile of stuff that we don't know. That was not the best way to communicate that in hindsight, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Anthony. How can I be better about communicating that, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love talking about unknown unknowns and known unknowns and things, right? So obviously your unknowns are tricky because they're unknown, but I think really digging into those known unknowns is what's most important, right? Listing those down, making sure to go through them, and kind of deciding, okay, how much clarity do we want on each of these? How much time do we want to spend understanding all of them, so that we can get a sense of how much risk is coming our way, right? And I think when you can go through and do that, it really helps then have that conversation, right? Because when you're talking to different stakeholders, then you have something to base it on. It's not just like, oh yeah, engineering always takes a little longer. We don't know. We'll see. Let's add some buffer, right? But you can really say, hey, look, here's a risk category, right? So, this is something we deal with, at Charles a lot when we're trying to deal with like new meta APIs, where we know there's always something that will kind of come in and surprise us. And so we always very clearly say like, hey, look, we're taking on this project. The known unknown is we'll see how this API actually works when we start making use of it, right? And that's true of a lot of partner APIs and those kinds of things. So just identifying that risk early on, communicating it to everybody is really the best thing you can do.
But yeah, Mariana.
Yeah, no, I think like to me something that's always helpful when I have like all of these unknowns is relying back into the basics and relying back into the customer. Maybe we are talking about different unknowns at some points, but it always ends up being about the customers and about the people who are going to be using it. I can recall a lot of times having like some really long discussions into how to implement certain feature, how to implement certain, for example, one was about how long we will be storing data and stuff like that. And end of the day, it was like, hey, let's make like a quick prototype. Let's call it an alpha. Let's throw it to customers that we know that are trusted customers, and let's expose ourselves to see how they use the product. And for example, sometimes you find out that that feature that was like a whole scope creep ends up not being that useful for the customer. And it's something that only you care about because you fall in love with your solution rather than with the problem that you are trying to solve. And I feel like that iteration with the customer always being a central part of it is really important. One of like my main things when I'm working on a product is that I always get customers to start talking to me and to like the champion engineer even before we start implementing anything. And we want to make really good friends with them. We want to be them to be design partners, to feel heard, and to start using the product even when it has a lot of rough edges, because it helps us to first go into the happy path, optimize for it, and then start finding the different edge cases that you want to have polished probably by GA. But having that iteration with customers is always super important, and it validates that you're actually solving a problem. Because end of the day, what I think you always have to be thinking about is how much stuff can I take out from this requirement doc, rather than how much stuff can I keep adding to it. You want to be the leanest that you can while solving the problem. You don't want to be just adding stuff for the sake of having more stuff on it.
I really like that. I think I'm going to take that approach into some docs that I need to write later. Just what is the fewest number of items I can put in this doc to get us somewhere? Yeah, that's a really great way to look at it. I'm sort of curious. I know we didn't really touch on this previously, but when we're talking about sort of looping back to that initial experiences where there was like this big communications gap in getting those requirements, and we started talking about tools and processes and all of that. And I'm curious, in the last like couple minutes, and no questions have come in, but like if you have questions, write them into the Zoom chat. We will happily answer them. Retrospectives. I know we do like typically in the industry, right? We do like incident reviews when or postmortems or whatever when an incident happens, and then we look at where everything went wrong, ideally blamelessly, and we look at our existing processes, and we sort of take a critical eye and say like, these are action items that we need to address, and this is how we move forward. I'm curious if any of you have done like process retrospectives around either times when something went really wrong in terms of like requirements gathering, and you know, you're like, oh wait, this is like a gap in our process, or this is a gap in how we plan, we need to do something about it. Or whether you regularly do retrospectives and sort of look at your requirements gathering process in general and sort of decide, okay, this isn't scaling for our scale as a company, this isn't scaling for our customers anymore, or this is too much, this is too onerous, we've made too many roadblocks, and now we're sort of paralyzed. Do you regularly do that, or do you find that it happens sort of organically? I'm curious to get your takes, Lais.
I think in my experience, very short, like I'm working on infrastructure, so I feel like sometimes lots of the requirements, yeah, they don't even come much from the outside, but I like in the example I gave and others, so Nubank has gone through international expansion, and so we learned a lot from the first, and I think a lot of like those playbooks and all like that checklist that all came from as a result of like a retrospective, like sitting down with all the other teams, like with the business folks and the legal and others, and then we're like, okay, we're gonna need to do this again. What can we do better? What can we improve, right? So I think a lot of the results that we saw in the process later was it came from that. But I think it was kind of more in this particular case that involved like so many people from different areas. It was kind of more like a one-off, like in particular to that situation, not something very often. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that it happens organically. Like it's something that you realize while you are doing it. It's like I'm always like asking myself and also asking engineers to challenge on when they are building something, why am I building it? What's the reason that I have to build this? Like for example, when we were building fluid compute, why am I building it? Why am I trying to change the way that the one-to-one relationship between requests and instances work? And end of the day, it has to tie back to the customer. It has to tie back to, for example, oh, I'm doing it so the workloads run in a more effective way. They run more efficiently using the same amount of hardware, but now being able to tolerate a workload that is larger. And this is really helpful. Why? Because nowadays, with all of this AI boom that we are having, requests are having more and more idle time while they're waiting for models to reason or to respond. It's not the same as when we were doing like just some query to a database that was optimized to take a couple of milliseconds. Now you actually want your LLM to spend time and giving you a better response. So you have more and more idle time, and that will become a problem. So why am I doing this? Because my customers' workloads are changing and I want to be more efficient on the use of resources for them. So they end up spending less and they end up having more cost effective while still performant infrastructure working for them. I feel like that kind of stuff ends up coming naturally. And sometimes when you find yourself without that background or without that context, it comes while you are working on it. I have engineers who have came and be like, hey, I need to understand why are we working on this? And usually we have an answer. But if we don't, then we have to rethink what are we doing and why are we doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. I think challenging assumptions is just super important. I've seen so many projects go wrong because of assumptions. And I think especially when things are changing super rapidly, as we're seeing now with AI, but it can happen in other projects as well, is things are changing. And I think especially, to the question, like when you need like a proper like retrospective on process and everything, I think when you've noticed there's been a big change in also your team structure or something, right? If, there are a lot of new faces, or if you just recently, if you made a change to the team structure, that's a great moment to say, hey, what are our processes? Does it make sense to maybe try something new? I think that's a great moment to challenge those assumptions. And I think another moment is I'm a huge fan of incubating new ways of working within teams, that you do it more naturally, right? So rather than starting from that big process that you say, hey, in this team, let's try changing our sprint cycle, or, doing a different Jira review, whatever it is, right? And then when you notice, okay, that's working there, then that's a good moment to then have a bigger meeting, maybe in a bigger discussion, and say, hey, can we take this process and apply it to everybody else too? This is a good moment to maybe roll it out.
Yeah, and it also changes from team to team. Like, for example, at Barcelo, I work with a lot of different teams, and different teams have different needs. And I know how much details and what kind of details each of those teams need to work effectively. Obviously, this is something that you end up nurturing across the org and by knowing each other for many years or many months or whatever. But still, I feel like I agree. You need to start with the team usually with something defined but kind of clean. So then you find out what's the best way for this team to execute effectively.
Yeah, and then we can sort of, well, we can't really because there's 1 minute left, but that would dive into a whole conversation about like top down versus bottom up requirements gathering and what that can be like and how we can bridge the gaps between the two and live in a happy medium. Because obviously, and I'm sure you all would probably agree that like there's a decent amount of work that is best suited for that bottom up approach, and there's a lot of work that is best suited for the bottom down approach. In the last 1 minute, I'm going to put each of you on the spot a little bit, but don't worry, it's going to be okay. I want to know, say you are given a document to review for a new product feature for the company that you work at. What is the question that you are most stereotypically, what is the question that most stereotypically you that you are going to end up dropping in that doc? And so for an example, I always end up playing a lot of devil's advocate going into docs. And I also really like to talk about load testing because that was a huge part of my career at Slack. And so I always like to say somewhere in the doc, well, okay, what are the limits we are preemptively putting on this thing? Thinking about like, is this used by humans? If it's used by humans, let's preemptively put some limits on those suckers. Please and thank you. All right, Mariano, you unmuted first.
Yeah. My question is usually, when can I get the first customer on it?
Love that. Lais.
Yeah, I think it's gonna sound very cheesy, but like, how does that thing scale? I'm always thinking on the infrastructure, like cloud is not infinite as we were sold. So like, how's that thing gonna scale? What's the plan for that thing to evolve in infrastructure?
You heard it here first, Lais. The cloud is not infinite. Anthony.
I'm gonna tend to be the one to ask about metrics if they're not already defined. A, how do we know we need to do this, right? Is there some number that shows this makes sense? And B, how are we gonna make sure it worked when we're done with it? So, and I think especially for engineers, I think engineers like to release things and then go look at what happened. And I think saying ahead of time, you know, whether it's load testing or whatever it may be, saying like, hey, here's a number we're looking for at the end to make sure it worked.
Perfect. Oh, that was such a great way to wrap up. I feel like I got a lot out of those answers, actually. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you all got something that you can take back to your teams from this discussion as well. We'll be popping into the Slack channel, the webinar Q&A Slack channel in the lead dev Slack team, so you can join us there. Otherwise, thank you all so much, panelists. It was so lovely to meet all of you and chat with you. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you all on another panel at another time.
Thank you.
See ya.